beyond. So this morning, we're going to bring Omar in by Skype. He is a prophet in his own right. The time has come for BDS and all forms of resistance like this. And we're so grateful for the focus on BDS that we all are called to at this moment. Omar is a brilliant spokesperson for the BNC, the Boycott National Movement in Palestine. It's a coalition now of, I think, about 200 NGOs and popular movements in Palestine, but now it's a global movement. This is part of a global intifada that we are now called to be part of. We have almost perhaps 300, 350 here, but thanks to our techies and Rochelle and others, there are 400 folk around the country who will be watching and with us. There's about 40 centers where people are collectively gathered to be with us this morning. So we invite you all now to listen to one of our great friends of Friends of Seville, but also the spokesperson for a national global movement. Let's hear it for Omar Barghouti.
Dear friends, dear Don, thank you so much for this wonderful introduction. I'm so sorry I could not be with you in person due to the effective travel ban imposed on me by the Israeli Ministry of Interior. We're facing much more serious threats, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I'm so inspired by the talks in this conference, by the spirit in this conference, that helps us steadfast, that helps us resist this oppression. South African Archbishop Emeritus Desmond Tutu has once likened the singling out of Israel's regime for unconditional military, political, and financial support by the US and other Western governments to placing Israel on a pedestal above every other state. Many people are afraid to criticize Israel's policies, Desmond Tutu argues, because of the exceptionally intimidating methods used by Israel's lobby. BDS is effectively working to take Israel's regime of occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid off that pedestal. Israel must be treated like every other state that commits similar crimes, period. Palestinian, Israeli, American, and other human rights defenders who are active in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement have experienced some of the worst forms of this bullying and intimidation that Desmond Tutu describes. Israeli government ministers are now publicly threatening leading BDS activists with targeted civil assassination. We're unnerved by these mafia-like threats, especially given the fast descent of Israeli society into fanatic fundamentalism, extreme colonial racism, and unprecedented levels of incitement to racial violence against the indigenous Palestinian people, and increasingly against our anti-colonial Israeli partners as well. We are unnerved, but we are most certainly undeterred. They can impose travel bans on us, threaten us with civil assassination, smear us in the media, and fabricate connections between us and militant organizations. But they cannot silence our voices, undermine our logic, or slow down the remarkable spread of our nonviolent human rights movement among millions of hearts and minds across the world and in the United States as well. Israel's election of the most extreme far-right government in its history and the formation of the most racist Knesset ever, as the Daily Haaretz calls it, have shed any democratic pretenses. Israel's regime has finally dropped the mask, giving further impetus to the already impressive growth of BDS. The BBC Globescan poll of international public opinion has consistently over the last few years shown Israel competing with North Korea in popularity around the world, including among Europe's largest nations. Equality is the key to rights. The BDS movement believes that, and it is therefore the sine qua non for real peace. The most profound human right is the right to have equal rights, irrespective of identity, as enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But to achieve equality, freedom, and justice must be realized. Rights and justice movements all over the world keenly realize this fact. Raising the slogan, freedom, justice, and equality, BDS has for the last 10 years contributed significantly to world peace by diligently challenging one of the most resilient and recurrent causes of war, Israel's warmongering regime of oppression. BDS has played a critical role in mainstreaming Palestinian rights in the discourse on the question of Palestine after more than 2 decades of a fraudulent peace process that entirely ignored human rights and served as a result as a fig leaf for the entrenchment and cover-up of Israel's occupation and denial of rights. BDS is not just a morally consistent volunteer-based movement that is anchored in international law. It is seriously effective. Former Israeli Mossad chief Shabtai Shavit is convinced that BDS has become a critical challenge to Israel's entire regime of injustice, while the former Prime Minister Ehud Barak admits that BDS is reaching a tipping point. Indeed, BDS has become a hot topic even in the US presidential elections and in Congress. The BDS movement was established on July 9th, 2005, with the launch of the BDS call by the absolute majority in Palestinian civil society as a response to Israel's violations of international law and the failure of the United Nations under US hegemony to uphold our rights. BDS aims to achieve 3 basic rights, without which the Palestinian people cannot exercise our inalienable right to self-determination. Those 3 rights are ending the 1967 occupation, including the colonies, the wall, and that includes East Jerusalem, obviously. Number 2, ending what even the United States State Department calls Israel's institutional, legal, and societal discrimination against its Palestinian citizens, and that amounts to apartheid, according to the UN definition. And the 3rd and most important right is the UN stipulated and inherent right of the Palestinian refugees to return to their homes of origin from which they were forcibly displaced in the 1948 Nakba and ever since. These 3 basic rights correspond to the 3 main constituencies that make up the Palestinian people. Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, make up 38% of the Palestinian people. Palestinian citizens of present-day Israel are 12%, and Palestinians in exile are about 50%. Between Palestinians in exile and the internally displaced Palestinians in historic Palestine, the total number of Palestinian refugees is 68% of our people. That makes the right of return the absolute most important right for the Palestinian people to exercise self-determination. Though launched in 2005, the BDS movement is deeply rooted in decades of Palestinian popular nonviolent resistance to settler colonialism and ethnic cleansing. It is inspired and strongly influenced by the South African anti-apartheid movement and the US civil rights movement. Despite the obvious differences between Israel's regime of oppression and that of apartheid South Africa, the similarities are striking, as many Israeli and South African analysts today recognize. Israel's regime of oppression against the Palestinian people is indeed a unique cocktail of systems of oppression, but it is in part a more sophisticated, evolved, and brutal form of apartheid than its South African predecessor, as recognized by Minister Ronnie Kasrils, who happens to be Jewish and who served in the first Mandela government, and Christian leaders who fought apartheid in South Africa. In fact, South Africa's current Speaker of Parliament, Ms. Baleka Mbete, has recently stated, quote, "Apartheid in South Africa was a picnic compared to what we have seen in the occupied Palestinian territories," end of quote. Anchored in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the BDS movement has consistently and categorically opposed all forms of racism and racial discrimination, including anti-Black racism, Islamophobia, and indeed anti-Jewish racism. We've categorically rejected that very consistently. One's identity, we believe, should never diminish or restrict one's entitlement to rights. BDS is an inclusive movement that enjoys growing support among very diverse communities, including a growing number of anti-Zionist Jewish Israelis. Jewish Israeli BDS supporters, in fact, play a significant role in exposing Israel's regime of oppression and advocating for isolating it. Though BDS calls for boycott measures in the academic, cultural, military, and economic fields, its impact on the latter, the economic aspect, was the trigger, we believe, for serious alarm in the Israeli establishment. According to the UN Conference on Trade and Development, foreign direct investment in Israel dropped by 46% in 2014 as compared to 2013, and one of the co-authors of that report, who happens to be an Israeli academic, attributed that massive decrease in foreign investment to the boycott partially and to the massacre in Gaza. A 2015 RAND Corporation study predicted that BDS may cost Israel in the coming 10 years between 1 to 2% of its GDP. That's between $28 and $56 billion in 10 years. Economic boycotts, whether used by the US civil rights movement or the South African anti-apartheid movement, have always been seen not as an end, but as a particularly consequential and effective means to compel the oppressor to stop its oppression. While academic and cultural boycotts helped to raise international awareness about apartheid and to hurt the brand of South Africa, the apartheid regime became extremely nervous when the boycott started hitting its pocket. Similarly, Israel's brand has started to take a hit around the world, mainly due to academic, cultural, and church-based boycott and divestment developments. Major churches in the US, including the Presbyterian Church, the United Methodist Church, and of course the United Church of Christ, have passed significant divestment and/or selective boycott resolutions. Pension funds and banks in Europe and trade unions around the world have divested. Just in the last few days, the NYU Graduate Student Workers Union and the UMass Amherst have voted for BDS. We are extremely, extremely inspired by that victory. Academic associations in the US and student governments on many Western campuses have endorsed BDS measures. It's important to reiterate that the academic and cultural boycott that we're calling for is institutional. It does not target Israeli individuals, but institutions due to their proven complicity in planning, implementing, and whitewashing Israel's crimes against the Palestinians. It therefore does not infringe on academic or artistic freedom. In the US in particular, Israel faces a steady erosion of its standing among minorities, women and young Americans, Jewish Americans included. In a recent survey, 47% of the most educated and influential opinion elites in the Democratic Party viewed Israel as, quote, a racist state. And after being informed about BDS, 31% supported it. As a result of all these direct and indirect indicators of the impact of BDS, Israel, its lobby groups, and its right-wing supporters have launched an unprecedented, well-funded global war on BDS, trying to silence, indeed disappear, Palestinian narratives and criminalize BDS advocacy, especially in Western countries. Israeli-induced attacks on free speech and civil rights in Europe, the US, Canada, and elsewhere are fostering an ominous environment of bullying, intimidation, and repression that has all the hallmarks of the era of McCarthyism in the US and the worst days of apartheid in South Africa. Having failed to stop the growing impact of BDS at the grassroots and civil society levels, Israel and its pressure groups are desperately pressuring governments, legislatures, and officials in the West to implement patently anti-democratic measures that threaten civil liberties at large. This should deeply concern not just activists supporting Palestinian rights, but all those who value civil rights, especially progressive movements struggling for racial justice, gender justice, social, economic, indigenous, environmental, and queer justice. The authoritarian measures adopted against BDS so far include the prosecution of BDS activists in France, proposals to exclude organizations that support BDS in the US from public funding or contracts, and the British government's intimidation of local councils that have voted to support BDS measures. In this context, we salute the Coalition for the Right to BDS in Maryland that has made it impossible to pass the anti-BDS legislation in the state. Glenn Greenwald has described this well-orchestrated series of draconian measures as the greatest threat to free speech in the West. But Israel's job is not easy. Enjoying impunity, thanks to US and European complicity, Israel is arrogantly trying to delegitimize the boycott, a time-honored tactic of resisting injustice, and thus to suppress free speech, forging alliances with far-right forces around the world that are often openly anti-Semitic. By fostering this new McCarthyism, in some circles in the US, France, the UK, and elsewhere, where criticism of Israel's policies is met with severe punitive measures, Israel is further alienating the liberal mainstream, including Jewish liberals, and losing the future leadership of the West. Israel is trying to criminalize boycott. Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks must be turning in their grave. BDS addresses comprehensive Palestinian rights, not simply ending the Israeli occupation of some densely populated Palestinian territory in order to save Israel as a purer apartheid. Under international law, Israel is the state that bears responsibility for the occupation and all other forms of injustice against the Palestinian people. The BDS movement calls for boycotting Israel, not just the settlements, just as South Africa was the target of boycotts due to its apartheid regime. If our call for equal rights and freedom is regarded as a threat to Israel's existence, what does that say about Israel? But BDS is not a one-size-fits-all type of movement. As a decentralized human rights movement, it has its rights-based platform that all partners agree on. But beyond that, when it comes to tactics and targeting, it adopts the principle of context sensitivity. This means that activists anywhere, the UCC, the Presbyterians, the unions, decide what to target, how to target it, and what kind of coalition they can build to achieve their goals. Ultimately, this is a goal-oriented movement. We're in it to achieve our rights, not to have fun, although sometimes it is fun. The four general criteria that the Palestinian BDS National Committee, the BNC, which leads the global BDS movement, recommends in selecting strategic BDS targets are: 1, level of complicity, focusing on companies and products that are most clearly involved in Israel's human rights violations, are easiest to explain to a wide mainstream audience. 2, intersectionality, prioritizing companies or products that enable the creation of broad cross-struggle alliances. That's a key focus. Targeting G4S, for example, the world's largest security company, opens the door to building strong coalitions with Black, Latino, asylum-seeking advocacy groups, among other groups whose rights are trampled upon by the company. And this is not an opportunistic alliance. This is an alliance of oppressed communities that face intersectional forms of oppression. The third, potential for success. Sometimes activists may forget that, but we in this movement have we do not embark on a campaign against a company unless we have a realistic chance of success beyond simply raising awareness. We do not have time to waste. As activists, as very effective activists, we're very economic with our time. The fourth and last criterion is media appeal. A target that helps to attract favorable media coverage also amplifies awareness raising. Therefore, it's important. Following these target selection guidelines, BDS has directly and indirectly charted some major achievements that have raised its international profile quite significantly. In September last year, Veolia, a French corporate giant, became the first international corporation to end all its involvement in illegal Israeli operations, following an extensive 7-year BDS campaign that costed tenders around the world worth over $20 billion. This has triggered a domino effect. Veolia was followed by Orange and CRH that also pulled out of Israel this year. Also in 2016, the United Methodist Church set a very important precedent, in the US that is, by divesting its pension fund of stock in Israeli banks that are involved in the occupation. The second largest Dutch pension fund, PGGM, had done the same, divested from Israeli banks in 2014. The Bahia region in Brazil has recently ended a contract with Mekorot, the Israeli apartheid water company, after a quick BDS campaign there. BDS is spreading very fast in Latin America, not just South Africa and the West. These developments in the economic field could not have transpired without years of academic and cultural boycott initiatives that have revealed Israel's brand to the world as one of occupation and colonial rule. Over 1,000 Black activists, artists, scholars, students, and organizations in the US and elsewhere have endorsed BDS. Also in 2015, almost 1,000 cultural figures in the UK signed a pledge in support of the cultural boycott of Israel, following similar initiatives in Montreal, Canada, Ireland, and South Africa. Artists who have recently canceled gigs in Tel Aviv include Thurston Moore and Lauryn Hill, the R&B sensation. Student governments at Stanford, UCLA, Berkeley, Northwestern, and many US, Canadian, and British universities have voted for various BDS measures, including divestment. I must say that I'm always deeply inspired and energized when I read the list of progressive groups that stood with SJP chapters behind almost all these divestment successes. You give us hope and strength to continue our struggle. In 2013 and 2014, more than 8 US academic associations, including the American Studies Association, adopted the academic boycott of Israel, as did the Teachers Union of Ireland. But what about anti-Semitism? Claiming that boycotting Israel or exposing the inherent racism of the political ideology of Zionism is anti-Semitic is itself an anti-Semitic statement, as it equates Israel and the Jews, putting all Jews into one monolithic basket represented entirely by the State of Israel. Anyone who denies Jewish diversity and says all Jews are one and the same is an anti-Semite. Israel's failure to date to undermine BDS can be partly attributed to the movement's consistent and categorical rejection of all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism, and its calls for equal rights for all humans, irrespective of identity. BDS targets Israel's regime of apartheid and colonial oppression and entities that are complicit in this system, not based on any real or claimed identity, but based on the fact that this regime of oppression denies Palestinians our rights under international law. BDS targets complicity, not identity. Israel is also very disturbed by the fast rise in the number of younger Jewish activists who are joining the ranks of BDS. Jewish American support for BDS has skyrocketed in recent years, with one poll conducted in November 2014 by a soft Israel lobby, supposedly, revealing that 46% of non-Orthodox Jewish American men under 40 support a full boycott of Israel. And that was 2 years ago. No wonder Jewish Voice for Peace is growing exponentially in the US. As a result, Israel's regime had to resort to its weapon of choice, smearing the movement with the ludicrous, unfounded accusation of anti-Semitism, repeating it through its massive propaganda network to make it stick. This had a chilling tactic on some in Europe and the US who support the boycott, given the guilt over the Holocaust and Israel's relative success for decades in channeling that guilt into complicity in Israel's regime of oppression against the Palestinians. This ignores what Holocaust survivors put in an ad in the New York Times, sponsored by IJAN, that never again to anyone. But this anti-Semitism smear tactic does not work with Palestinians, the victims of Zionism and its settler colonial project, who played no role in the Holocaust and should not be made to pay for it with our UN-stipulated rights. In conclusion, BDS is an inclusive, non-sectarian, and democratic community of principled activists and organizations worldwide that speaks truth to power and understands how to galvanize the soft power generated by concerted, strategic, and persistent citizens' pressure on complicit corporations, banks, and institutions. BDS empowers the Palestinian people everywhere to effectively and creatively resist oppression, and in doing so, to undo not just the colonization of our land, but also the colonization of some of our minds. That is the dehumanization and internalized self-depreciation that result from sustained oppression. Resistance based on clear ethical principles, after all, creates the possibility of a new human beyond oppression. As a BDS activist, as a human rights defender, I am deeply inspired and guided by the words of the late Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, who wrote, quote, "The oppressed must not, in seeking to regain their humanity, become oppressors of the oppressors, but rather restorers of the humanity of both," end of quote. With such ethical clarity, together we can take Israel's regime of apartheid and colonial oppression off the pedestal and put an end to its bullying, criminality, and McCarthyism. United, we can resist the intersectional injustices that many of us face. Together, we shall prevail. Thank you.
Eric. Keep it on.
Okay, so we have about 30 minutes for question and answer for both Reverend Hagler and Omar Barghouti. So please find note cards in your folders, or they may be passed around now by volunteers. And we have Reverend Dog Wagner here to facilitate the discussion.
Omar, are you still there?
Yes, I'm still with you. Greetings to Reverend Hagler.
So you should have note cards, so we're going to collect those and we'll read them as we did last night. But Omar, thank you so much for that comprehensive, amazing synthesis. We have our marching orders, but this is the center of this conference in many ways. What we've heard about justice from Grayling this morning, the prophetic challenge, and then this amazing analysis of the movement and what we have to do to be part of globally now to bring change. So let's have the first question. Addressed to Omar and Raylan, of course, if you have something to add. Why don't the Palestinians just declare to the world that Palestine is a state? What considerations keep them from doing this? Omar?
Yes, the BDS movement does not take a position on one state versus two states discussion. We believe that regardless what the solution to the Palestinian question might be, it has to address our three basic rights under international law: ending the occupation, ending apartheid, and enabling Palestinian refugees to return to their homes of origin. Without that, there can never be a just peace, a sustainable peace. So we are not, as a movement, as a huge coalition in Palestinian society, in historic Palestine and in exile, we are not in the process of discussing one state versus two states. We have no position on that.
Thank you. Can everybody hear Omar okay in the back? Need the volume up? Okay. Here's one of my favorite topics. In his letter from a Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King criticized the white liberal moderates for standing in the way of solving the problems of injustice. Are white liberal moderates part of the problem in finding a solution in Israel-Palestine? Raylan, you even may want to weigh in. But first, Omar.
We've studied that letter by Martin Luther King very, very keenly, and it has inspired us tremendously. Indeed, we faced this insight that Martin Luther King shares with the world. In the beginning, in the first years of BDS, a very important impediment was so-called liberal Zionists, our equivalent of the liberal whites in the US facing the civil rights movement, who tried to convince us, you have to be reasonable. You can't call for all your rights after all. You just have to go with ending the occupation of 67. Forget about Israel itself inside 48 being an apartheid regime. Forget about the refugees, because you cannot achieve all that. You have to be reasonable. And we said, you know, you've been acting like gatekeepers for decades, telling us what we can and what we cannot do or say, and telling the rest of the world how they can or they cannot be in solidarity with Palestine. It's time to move over and give up that role. We are talking to the world directly, and as Desmond Tutu once said, we want the full menu of rights because we are entitled to it.
One thing about the history of that letter was that originally it came out from clergy people that was criticizing the king for breaking basically Jim Crow laws. And so it was saying that if you're a Christian, how can you break the law? And basically it was citing Paul, in terms of Paul talking about the respectability of the law. And also in that letter was not only therefore the religious structure that King was critiquing, but it was also, in a sense, liberals who were questioning why there was such disruption. And isn't there basically a clean way to get towards freedom? Because people did not want to have to deal with the aggravation and what seemed to be the dissension and destruction, not destruction, but really the debate that was taking place in terms of the issue. But you know, that's the thing, is that one of the things that we have to resign ourselves to is that yes, people are going to be upset on the right, on the left, wherever. But the issue is if our cause is a just cause, if our cause is trying to lift up humanity, then we need to go there and deal with all the messiness of the process.
I'm going to take a point of privilege here. I think it's also a theological problem that in our time, so often injustice and the cry of the poor is marginalized, as Grayling pointed out this morning. And we in FASNA, Sabille, and so many others in the major churches find that many of our biggest problems in the denominations in resisting BDS are from some of the moderates who buy into a Zionist narrative. We need to press the liberation, Palestine liberation theology, and the theology that King, the civil rights, and the anti-apartheid movement stood upon of liberation. And the cry of the poor, that there is a bias toward the cry of the poor in the theology of Jesus. Why is the BDS dialogue not including the injustice, violence, murder, and destruction in Gaza being blamed solely on Israel, with the competing Palestinian factions, including Hamas and Fatah, the PLO, the Islamic Brotherhood, are not included as they are killing each other and even withholding aid? Omar?
Sure. Our position as a nonviolent human rights movement is that anyone who's truly interested in peace, in undoing violence, must address the root causes of all violence in our situation, and that's Israel's regime of occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid. Now, if a rapist gets some scratches on his face by the rape victim, can you blame the rape victim of violence? Well, maybe, maybe not. But one thing is for sure, end the rape, and then you won't have those scratches on your faces. It's the problem of the rapist, first and foremost. Now, about the so-called internal fighting, I don't know where the premise of this question rests on. We have not heard of hundreds of Palestinians killing each other. This is simply false. It's not happening. Of course, there's internal fighting, mostly political fighting, not so much violent internal fighting. We don't have a Palestinian civil war under occupation in Gaza or anywhere else. We have repression, we have lack of democracy, we have many other social ills and cultural ills that we have to deal with in parallel with resisting the overarching system of oppression and injustice that Israel presents. So we do not ignore the social, cultural, democratic agenda while fighting the settler colonialism and apartheid.
Just to try to offer some historical perspective, because you remember in sort of the latter days of the anti-apartheid movement, it was the ANC. And then all of a sudden, the South African government came up with Lacey, who was also being crowned and blessed at the university, at Boston University, in order to try to confuse the discussion about whether it was this group or that group, when the issue was really dismantling apartheid. And so again, it was those who were dominant in the culture and had power that were able, in a sense, to attempt to, but they didn't succeed, but attempt to manipulate the debate to something else.
Right.
Okay, Omar, the next, I got two here that are somewhat related. You can take them in sequence. You spoke of three principles of the BDS movement. Could you reiterate for them, so we can catch them again? Was the third one to repatriate the Jews, that is, send them back to their country of origin, or did they misunderstand
that? No, I'll reiterate. Sorry, maybe the technology is not helping us very well. The person may not have heard, so I'll repeat the three rights, which are written, by the way, in the 2005 BDS Call: ending the occupation, ending the system of racial discrimination, which amounts to apartheid, and the right of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes of origin, from which they were systematically ethnically cleansed during the 1948 Nakba and ever since. This is an inherent right that is upheld by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, by UN resolutions, and so on and so forth. Now, if the person who's asking this question is saying, what do you do with Jewish refugees who left their home countries in the Arab world, Egypt, Iraq, Yemen, Morocco, Tunisia, whatever, and moved to Israel to join in the settler colonial project of colonizing Palestine at the time? What do you do with those? Don't they have rights to return to their homes of origin? Of course they do. They have, every refugee has a right to return to his or her home of origin and to get compensated for whatever property they had lost. That applies to every refugee. And one thing about the BDS movement, we're very ethically consistent. We do not apply one principle to one set of groups and another principle to other. Every human being, irrespective of identity, is entitled to the same set of rights.
And here's the second one. What is your position as a spokesperson for the BDS movement of specific Israeli cultural performers who perform here in the US? Should we be boycotting them?
I'm not a spokesperson of the movement. I'm one of the founders of the movement. I'm part of the leadership of this movement. But concerning Israeli concerts in the US, the cultural boycott guidelines are very, very specific. We do not target Israeli individuals, we target Israeli institutions. And that's a key difference, by the way, between the academic and cultural boycott that we're calling for and that which was in place in South Africa, in fighting apartheid in South Africa, which was a blanket boycott against everyone and everything. In the Palestinian BDS movement, we target institutions, not individuals. Now, so if there's a band, an orchestra, Israeli orchestra coming to play in Santa Cruz, we would call for boycotting that orchestra because we're not aware of any cultural institution in Israel that publicly supports Palestinian rights under international law, which is a condition, a minimal condition, to be non-complicit in Israel's regime of oppression. There's one exception to this rule of boycotting institutions versus individuals. We do not call for boycotting individuals, except if the individual is no longer an individual, but a cultural ambassador. There are some cases, Eidan Reichel, I think his name is, one of the Israeli singers, who is sponsored by the Israeli government. So he's part of the Brand Israel campaign. He is paid for by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Israel to go and whitewash Israeli crimes, especially after Israel commits massacres in Gaza 2014, 2012, 2009. They send their artists and their ballet dancers and their musicians to whitewash Israel's regime of oppression. So if an Israeli artist decides to take money from the Israeli government in order to participate in its branding and whitewashing of its crimes against the Palestinians, he is no longer, or she is no longer considered an individual artist, but a cultural ambassador. And therefore, we would call for a boycott of their concerts, obviously. There's another criterion in the guidelines, which is the common sense boycott, beyond our guidelines, beyond the BDS guidelines. If an artist is racist, justifies genocide, justifies incites to violence, for example, regardless against whom. He could be anti-Black racist, anti-Palestinian, anti-misogynist, whatever the case may be. People around the world might call for a boycott of his concerts. And that's a common sense boycott beyond the PACB guidelines, beyond the Palestinian campaign for the academic and cultural boycott of Israel. We do not endorse individual boycotts, but we fully understand why people might call for boycotts of such racist individuals who justify war crimes.
I'll give you a break, everyone. Pastor Hegler, what do you think about the movement of Christian churches who stockpile money in their endowment funds?
Well, those endowment funds need to be clean in terms of, from my perspective, needs to be cleaned in terms of ethics, in terms of not contributing to the destruction of life at home or the life anywhere else in the world. Therefore, we really need to look at it in terms of not only divesting those funds from clearly companies that continue to support the occupation of the West Bank and Palestine, but also need to look at not being in, from my perspective, defense, not being in all those other kinds of things that really sort of wholesale breeds destruction in our world. And give you some of that clean money.
Okay, back to Omar. Do you think that the anti-BDS legislation in the U.S. can withstand the legal challenges based on free speech?
I'm not a lawyer by any stretch of the imagination, but from all the reports we've read, especially by Palestine Legal, by the Center for Constitutional Rights, American Civil Liberties Union, National Lawyers Guild, the answer is absolutely not. We do not think that any of these anti-BDS legislation pieces can stand to the court challenge because they are a violation of the First Amendment to the US Constitution, the Free Speech Amendment. Excuse me. In the NAACP versus Claiborne hardware in 1982, where Claiborne was suing the NAACP for calling for a boycott of the company because of its racist policies, it reached all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court in 1982 decided that boycotts for economic, political, or social change are protected speech. They are protected by the US Constitution. So that's why I said that Israel runs into a serious problem in the US. By trying to delegitimize BDS, it's going against a constitutional right. It's going against free speech. And therefore, it's facing this dilemma. On the one hand, it has failed to suppress BDS by any other means. Even the anti-Semitism smear is not really sticking with so much Jewish support for BDS, with the consistency of BDS in rejecting all forms of racism coming across. Israel is failing on that front. So the only thing it can resort to is suppress BDS from above by passing laws that delegitimize the movement. But by doing so, it runs the risk of alienating liberal Americans, the mainstream liberal constituencies. Even those fence sitters who up till now would not support BDS will jump and say, we might not support BDS, but we support the right to BDS. That's a very different story. And there you can even get the New York Times to support that right.
Thank you. And here, just a commercial, there's a group of wonderful young Palestinian lawyers called Palestine Legal. And they've been wonderful with the challenges to the SJP groups around the country, but also FOSDA we had to do a webinar, and we probably need to repeat it, but be aware of Palestine Legal. Next, how can we push for the release of Palestinian political prisoners like Omar Barghouti and challenge the Zionist excuse that there is no year in which the
Oppressor regimes always say there's no one to negotiate with in the oppressed community. I mean, that's common. It's not just Israel, it's South Africa. It's in every oppressive regime's nature to deny that the oppressed have anyone to talk to. It's part of the dehumanization. But regardless, going back to the question, the most effective way to bring about Palestinian rights, including releasing Palestinian political prisoners like Marwan Barghouti, Ahmed Saadat, and all the other political prisoners, is by sustaining pressure on Israel's regime of oppression and boycotting, divesting from companies that are specifically involved in Israel's prison systems, like G4S, the large British security company. G4S is also involved in detention centers across the United States, where predominantly the victims are people of color, juvenile detention centers, refugees, asylum seekers detention centers, and so on. And that's why the 1,000 black figures that called for supporting BDS specified G4S as a possible target that can connect Black struggle, the justice struggle for Black communities in this country, in the United States, with the Palestinian struggle for freedom, justice, and equality. We think targeting G4S is a very effective way to bring about the release of Palestinian political prisoners, but it's not sufficient. We need to apply pressure on Israel's regime as a whole, because it is responsible ultimately for the crimes against Palestinian political prisoners.
And to underscore G4S is one of the targets that JVP and FOSNA are focusing on now nationally. And we really need your help. Rochelle Downs, our community organizer, Stan Rochelle, is really working hard on this and the workshop will focus exactly on this and the need for municipal campaigns. G4S says it will get out in the territories in 2017. We say, we'll believe it when we see it. So we need to keep the pressure on G4S. Now, I don't know, this one is probably for Graylin, and I'd love to hear Omar's thoughts on it. Is there any hope for Pope Francis to come out more strongly for Palestinian rights? You have any inroads, any insights? We'll start with Graylin.
Well, I pray that he will come to that theological point of view. I know that there's a lot of discussion going on within the Catholic Church, particularly in regards to the issue of Palestine and human rights. Trying to frame that within the context of the overall human rights struggle in the world. And so I know that the discussion is going on. I have no idea when he's going to come on.
Omar, you want to take a crack at that or take a pass?
Sure. I think Pope Francis is among the most progressive popes we've seen in the last few decades, and that gives us some hope. But like any head of a huge institution that is conservative by nature, does not move quickly by nature, he would need a lot of grassroots support in Catholic churches across the world to help him take courageous steps, not just towards Palestine, towards every other injustice that concerns the church and the Catholic communities around the world, gay rights and other issues, the marriage and so on and so forth. It's very important to have grassroots support, because the establishment is quite conservative and has many who oppose Palestinian rights and who would like to keep business as usual with Israel in order not to anger the US Congress. That's how it goes. You don't bother Israel because you'll bother Uncle Sam, and then you might get some nasty repercussions. So we need to hear from Catholic constituencies. And we understand that this brings up the history of the Catholic Church's involvement in the Holocaust. And this is the blackmailing stick that Israel is holding against the church. If you dare to support Palestinian rights, we might confiscate some of your properties in Palestine, and we might raise the specter of your historic involvement with the Holocaust, and therefore scandalize the church. It's time to stop this blackmail and to reject the church's history. Whatever collaboration with the Nazi regime has to be condemned in unequivocal language, but that should never justify staying silent before Israel's crimes, current crimes against the Palestinian people.
Thank you so much for that answer. Did you note we need grassroots pressure on the Catholic establishment and the Catholic Church? There's a type of Catholic Christian Zionism that immobilizes them with post-Holocaust guilt and dialogue. So we really need more pressure there, along with the other denominations. So thank you for that. And Omar, could I ask you to repeat the question? This will help the folks listening in who may not get the feed when I read it. So if you could repeat the question for our other listeners outside this.
The question was whether we have any hope that Pope Francis may take a positive position on Palestinian rights and push for a solution that respects Palestinian rights.
Okay, now here's the next question. With the Israeli Silicon Valley connection increasingly embedded in so much technology, software, etc., how does the BDS movement challenge this connection that may even be apparent to BDS sympathetic consumers?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear that very well there.
With the Israeli Silicon Valley connection increasingly embedded in so much technology, software, etc., how does the BDS movement challenge this connection that may not even be apparent to BDS consumers? You know, the BDS movement itself.
Sure. One way to challenge that is by selecting a target that makes sense. A company that is deeply complicit in Israel's violations of Palestinian rights, of international law, and that's very involved in this technological link between Silicon Valley and Israel. HP, Hewlett-Packard, is an excellent example. It's involved in the siege of Gaza by providing computer systems to the Israeli Navy. It's involved in Israeli military checkpoints, settlement computer systems, the army computer systems, you name it. HP is one of the most complicit technology companies in Israel's violations of international law. So it would make sense to target HP. If HP becomes the Veolia of today, Veolia suffered 7 years of a very intense BDS campaign across the world, costing it more than $20 billion. If HP faces a similar fate, if BDS grows against HP in a similar way, in the next year, we cannot afford 7 years. In the next year, if we all push for a very strong boycott of HP, divestments from HP, as churches have done, the Presbyterians, UCC, and so on, then HP will listen, because it's much more sensitive to such criticism than Veolia. It cares about its reputation as a company that cares for equality, for human rights, for freedom of movement, blah blah blah, as several companies in Silicon Valley claim to care. So when we expose that you're involved in checkpoints that prevent freedom of movement, that impose segregation, which counters all the values that you supposedly stand for, we expose HP's complicity, and that encourages the boycott. I think that would be the best case, picking one target rather than spreading ourselves too thin and looking at the massive problem of Israeli technology's integration into Silicon Valley. Targeting one company teaches everyone a lesson, and then you see a domino effect.
Okay, this has to be the last one. We're out of time. We're going to head for workshops. This has been a powerful morning, and we hate to end it, but we'll give this one to Omar. Can you give us one very important principle to write about in short letters to the editor about Israel and Palestine, and where we need to be going?
Which paper, which editor? If you're writing for the New York Times, it's different than the Santa Cruz Chronicle, whatever the paper might be. So the question would be more specific.
Sorry, could you repeat that? Or did you want me to repeat?
Which?
Yeah.
The question is, what would be the most important principle you would want us to focus on in writing short, effective letters to our newspapers or even the broader media?
Yeah, what I was saying that this is context sensitive as well. If one were writing a mainstream newspaper, which is inherently biased, I would focus on the very basic principle of equality. What Palestinians ultimately are calling for, equal rights like all other humans around the world. Why should we be denied our basic rights under international law just for the convenience of maintaining an Israeli supremacist apartheid regime? And the second point is, if Americans would tolerate what Israel does to the Palestinians, imagine what would happen to the United States. Now, when I said this, I hesitated for a bit because if Trump makes it, God knows what might happen in the US. But until now, we can raise this question. Imagine living under a system where your identity decides your official entitlement to rights. I mean, we know Blacks and Latinos do not enjoy equal rights. There's systematic racism, systematic oppression in the US. But at least it's not legalized. It's not by law. If you have black skin, you're not allowed to get 1, 2, 3, 4 in terms of constitutional rights. In Israel, it goes by your identity. If you're not Jewish, you're not entitled to the full set of rights, even if you're a citizen. So again, we can explain equality, we can expand on equality, but ultimately, we can put the slogan of BDS, freedom, justice, and equality, as something that every person can relate to.
So on behalf of all of us, Omar and Brilliant, thank you for what you've given us this morning, the inspiration, but the specific challenges. And Omar, we are with you, and it's clear we need to redouble our efforts now on BDS and the long journey to liberation for Palestine. Thank you, Omar, so much. We're with you. Thank you very much.